December 1995. In Rettendon, a farm worker and his friend noticed a metallic blue Range Rover parked on a muddy farm track. He thought some poachers had parked there and he was ready to wrestle them. But when he approached it, he found 3 lifeless bodies instead, blasted apart at point-blank range inside the car. The Essex Boys were dead. Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe, Britain's most feared drug crew, thought no one could catch them, but one wrong deal sealed their fate. The last 12 hours of their lives show exactly how 3 dangerous men were set up like fools and killed in cold blood. So, what happened in those last 12 hours before their death? How did 3 men who trusted no one walk straight into their Well, understanding who they were explains why someone wanted them dead. Craig Rolfe sat behind the wheel, still in drive position, as if he had just stopped at traffic lights. At 26, he was the crew's weakest link. While Pat Tate and Tony Tucker commanded respect through fear and money, Rolfe was essentially their chauffeur. His cocaine habit made him unreliable, but his loyalty kept him alive. Police believed he died first, probably never seeing the gun that killed him. His 7-year-old daughter Georgia would grow up without a father because he had chosen to drive for the wrong people. Tony Tucker was different. He was smarter, more calculated. On paper, he ran a legitimate security company, where he would supply bouncers to Essex nightclubs. In reality, those bouncers were his drug distribution network. Tucker had turned club security into a criminal empire. He would move ecstasy and cocaine through every venue he controlled. The business was good as he was making at least £1,500 a week. He had a £250,000 house and a few luxury cars. He even worked as a minder for boxing champion Nigel Benn, giving himself a veneer of respectability. But Tucker's real business happened in darkened clubs, where his pills kept the party going. Then there was Pat Tate, the one everyone feared. Tate was fresh out of prison on parole, just 6 weeks before his murder. He was violence incarnate. In fact, his criminal record seemed like a thriller. You find armed robbery here, along with drug dealing and a dramatic courthouse escape on a motorbike. He had almost made it to Spain before getting caught in Gibraltar. Even behind bars couldn't contain him for long. The man lived on cocaine and steroids, had a hair-trigger temper, and left a trail of enemies wherever he went. The thing is, Tate's violence was not just reserved for enemies. It could explode at anyone who crossed him. His own mother called him a liability and said that he was always high, paranoid, and impossible to control. The night before he was murdered, he proved it again. He phoned the London Pizza Company in Basildon, barking for a pizza with 4 different toppings on each quarter. When the young manager hung up on his attitude, Tate stormed down in person. He ripped the till from the counter, hurled it against the wall, then dragged Ryle into the bathroom, smashing his head against the glass plate. Like so many others, Ryle never pressed charges. Now you can imagine what kind of man he was. Just months before his death, someone had already tried to kill him. They shot him through his bathroom window while he showered. Hospital staff found drugs and a handgun under his pillow. That was Pat Tate. Never unarmed, never safe, never sorry. Together, these 3 had built something formidable in Essex's criminal underworld. They were not international kingpins, but in their territory, mentioning their names made people shudder with fear. What they didn't realize was how quickly that reputation could become a death sentence. Everything changed on the 16th of November, 1995. That's when Leah Betts walked into a house party in Latchington to celebrate her 18th birthday. Like thousands of other teenagers caught up in Britain's rave culture, she decided to try ecstasy. It was 1 pill and 1 mistake. Hours later, she collapsed and was hospitalized. 5 days later, she was dead. Leah's death became a national tragedy. Her father was a retired police officer and the family made a devastating decision. They released a photograph of their daughter lying unconscious in intensive care, tubes down her throat, machines keeping her alive. That image exploded across every newspaper in Britain. This made ecstasy a crisis demanding action. For Tony Tucker and the Essex Boys, this was a huge problem. The pill that killed Leah hadn't come directly from them, but Tucker controlled security at the clubs where ecstasy flooded the dance floors. To police, politicians, and an outraged public, he was now part of the supply chain that killed the teenager. His carefully constructed empire was suddenly in trouble. Every transaction and deal after that carried the risk of a life sentence. The pressure was immense, and it pushed them toward one final, fatal mistake. Here comes another man in this story. Michael Steele. Steele represented everything the Essex Boys were not. He was patient, methodical, and genuinely dangerous. While Tucker played gangster in nightclubs, Steele was running sophisticated smuggling operations across Europe. He moved cocaine and cannabis in quantities that dwarfed the Essex Boys' retail operation. Where they dealt in grams and pills, he dealt in kilos and shipping containers. Initially, the partnership made sense. Steele needed reliable distributors, and the Essex Boys needed quality suppliers. But criminal partnerships rarely survive success, and this one was doomed by the oldest poison in the business: greed. The first crack appeared when Steele allegedly sold Pat Tate washing powder disguised as cocaine. Whether this actually happened or was just paranoid speculation hardly mattered. Tate believed it, and he responded as you would expect him to respond. He threatened to kill Steele. Meanwhile, Craig Rolfe was bragging about a massive 30-kilo cocaine shipment supposedly arriving before Christmas. Now, this kind of loose talk is what gets people killed in this business. Tucker, meanwhile, was feeling the heat from Leah Betts' death and desperately needed a big score to prove his crew was still viable. The desperation was obvious, and in the drug trade, desperation is blood in the water. The 5th of December, 1995. The Essex Boys had no idea they were living their final hours. Pat Tate paced his girlfriend's house in Basildon like a caged animal. His phone was glued to his ear. 3 weeks had passed since Leah Betts died, and the heat was suffocating for him. Police raids were becoming routine, suppliers were getting nervous, and money was running short. But tonight promised salvation in the form of 30 kilos of pure Colombian cocaine. The irony was that the very man Tate had threatened to kill was now their lifeline. Michael Steele had supposedly arranged a massive shipment from Holland, and after weeks of tension, he was ready to do business. For Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe, this deal was going to be their comeback. Land this shipment, and they would be flush with cash, back on top, untouchable again. What they couldn't see was the trap closing around them with mathematical precision. Tate's calls that evening were frantic, desperate even. He rang Tony Tucker repeatedly, pushing for details, demanding confirmation. Tucker, ever the businessman, was juggling multiple conversations with suppliers, contacts, and anyone who might have information about tomorrow's meet. His security company provided perfect cover for these calls, but the desperation in his voice could not be mistaken. Craig Rolfe stayed close, engine running, ready to ferry his bosses wherever the business demanded. Then came the 6th of December. Phone mass data would later reveal a spider's web of calls crisscrossing Essex, Basildon to Fobbing, Rettendon to London. Steele's number appeared frequently in these records. He was carefully orchestrating his former partner's destruction. The meeting was set for the evening, a pre-meeting, Steele called it, to scout the location before the big shipment arrived. It was professional and sensible, so exactly the kind of precautions smart criminals would appreciate. Tucker told his girlfriend they were celebrating that night. After weeks of pressure and paranoia, they could finally see light at the end of the tunnel. But as that afternoon melted into evening, the final pieces clicked into position. Rolfe pulled up in his dark blue Range Rover, the same vehicle that would become their tomb within hours. Tucker climbed into the passenger seat, probably reviewing their strategy one last time. Tate settled into the back, his bulk filling the space. They drove through Basildon as the December darkness deepened, Tucker making last-minute calls to confirm details. One call went to Steele, who directed them toward Workhouse Lane in Rettendon. It was a remote farm track perfect for private business. Another went to Tucker's girlfriend. Phone records timestamped this final call at just before 7 PM. His tone suggested a man expecting a payday, not a man driving to his execution. The Range Rover turned onto the muddy track at exactly the wrong moment in history. Rolfe stopped the car and left it in drive. The engine was off, but the gear selector showed they expected to move again soon. 3 men sat in the darkness, probably discussing strategy, checking their phones, waiting for Steele to arrive and lead them to untold riches. Instead, death came calling with a pump-action shotgun. 8 shots at point-blank range shattered the winter silence. Craig Rolfe died first, slumping against the steering wheel. Tony Tucker followed, his business brain splattered across the passenger window. Pat Tate, the feared enforcer, tried to shield himself in those final seconds. Arms raised defensively against incoming death. It didn't matter, he died along with his companions. Within seconds, 3 of Essex's most feared criminals were reduced to bloodied corpses in a mud-stained Range Rover. The killers melted back into the darkness, leaving behind 3 bodies that wouldn't be discovered until morning. When the bodies were found on that cold December morning in 1995, the Essex Police Murder Squad knew they had walked into something that was going to haunt them. It was Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley who was handed this case. Ivan Dibley stared at the crime scene photos spread across his desk and knew his career was about to be defined by what happened next. 3 of Essex's most feared criminals lay dead in a Range Rover, and the only witnesses were crows picking at the frozen mud. There were no weapons, no fingerprints, no DNA found. Now, Dibley had to prove that professional killers weren't untouchable in his patch. What he couldn't have predicted was how a routine drug bust 6 months later would crack the case wide open and expose the whole conspiracy. The investigation began with methodical police work and a stroke of luck. Michael Steele had been on their radar since his release from a 9-year cannabis smuggling sentence, and for good reason. Steele was a former pilot who understood logistics, borders, and how to move serious weight without detection. His operation included rigid inflatable boats launched from Levington Marina, crossing to Belgium under cover of darkness, then racing back to isolated beaches along the Essex coast. Customs officers had actually tailed one of Steele's boats by spotter plane, tracking it all the way to Blankenberge and back toward Clacton. They missed the shore transfer that night, but they had mapped his entire operation. What they didn't realize was that they were also building a case file for murder. Jack Holmes moved in Steele's shadow like a loyal guard dog. He was younger, more violent, and absolutely devoted to his mentor. Where Steele provided the brains, Holmes supplied the muscle. From the outside, they looked unstoppable. From the inside, they were about to be destroyed by their own driver. Darren Nichols was nobody special. He was a small-time dealer who ferried packages and kept his mouth shut. When police stopped his van on May 13th, 1996, and found 10 kilos of cannabis hidden in a toolbox, it seemed like just another drug seizure. But within hours, the net was closing around much bigger fish. He ratted out Steele and Holmes and claimed that they killed the Essex Boys. Steele was dramatically arrested after a hard stop on the A12. Holmes was lifted from GT commercials in Suffolk, where the boat was stored. What had started as a routine drugs operation was about to become the break that solved Britain's most notorious gangland execution. Nichols told investigators that he had not witnessed the actual shootings. That would have been too convenient, too theatrical for a real murder case. Instead, he provided something far more valuable: the practical mechanics of professional killing. According to his account, he drove Steele and Holmes toward Rettendon that December evening, dropped them near the farm track, then waited in the growing darkness. The call that summoned him back lasted exactly 4 seconds. This was barely enough time to say "pick us up" before the line went dead. When Nichols arrived at the collection point, both men were out of breath, wearing gloves, and carrying weapons. But it was what he claimed to overhear that made his testimony genuinely chilling. Steele supposedly bragging that Pat Tate had squealed like a baby during the execution. Now, it was the phone records that transformed speculation into certainty. Cell site analysis revealed a spider's web of calls crisscrossing Essex on the 6th of December, tracking movements with scientific precision. Holmes had contacted both Tucker and Tate during the day, setting up the fatal meeting under the pretense of scouting a new aircraft landing strip for drug imports. The call that exposed the killer's desperation came from an unexpected source. Pat Tate's girlfriend, Sarah Saunders, phoned Steele's mobile that night. For Steele, this was a bad sign, because if Tate had told Sarah that he was meeting Steele, their carefully constructed cover story would have collapsed immediately. Nichols later described Steele's panic when that call came through. It was a moment of genuine terror from a man who thought he had controlled every variable. 4 seconds after the estimated time of the murders, Holmes made that brief call to Nichols. The phone records didn't lie, even when the alibis started flowing. Forensically, the crime scene told its own brutal story. 7 spent 12-gauge cartridges were recovered, all microscopically matched to the same pump-action shotgun. 8 shots had been fired, but only 7 casings were found inside the vehicle. Nichols claimed Steele's gun had fallen apart during the shooting. If true, the missing cartridge could have remained in the weapon when it was removed from the scene. The murder weapon was never recovered, though police later found a pump-action shotgun at Steele's address. In the world of professional crime, weapons disappear as quickly as witnesses. The trial that opened at the Old Bailey in September 1997 became a masterclass in how circumstantial evidence can be more powerful than eyewitness accounts. The Crown's case was methodical. Steele had motive to eliminate the Essex Boys, opportunity through his criminal network, and means through his access to weapons. The phone evidence placed him at the crime scene despite his denial. Watching the defense's strategy was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Steele produced alibi evidence that seemed solid initially. It was a Texaco credit card receipt, timestamped at 5:01 PM, claims he had visited Tesco, assertions he was home by 7:30 PM when family members arrived to view his house. Under cross-examination, however, every element crumbled. The alibi had been filed 10 months late, the receipts didn't conclusively match, and his key witness admitted she had only fixed the date after consulting with Steele's solicitor. Holmes's defense was even more transparent. He initially told police he had never been to Rettendon. It was a categorical denial that cell site data immediately exposed as a lie. When confronted with electronic proof of his presence in the area, his story magically evolved to include that now he remembered being at the Wheatsheaf pub nearby during the time of the murders. The jury was invited to believe he had simply forgotten his whereabouts during the original interviews. The defense's most dramatic gambit came in the form of Billy Jasper, a career criminal who claimed he had driven an East End enforcer nicknamed Mr. D to execute the Essex Boys as a paid hit for a rival organisation. He said that he saw sports bags containing sawn-off shotguns, and that his post-murder payments were made in cash and cocaine, and the professional killers vanished into London's criminal underworld afterward. It was exactly the kind of alternative theory that could create reasonable doubt. Unfortunately for the defense, Jasper's story could not survive basic scrutiny. He had a documented history of fantasy confessions, a £400 a day drug habit that made him desperately unreliable, and his timeline couldn't be corroborated by phone records or independent witnesses. When investigators checked his claims against cell site data and surveillance records, they found nothing but empty air. The jury heard his testimony but was not fooled by criminal theatre. On the 20th of January 1998, after 5 days of careful deliberation, the jury delivered unanimous guilty verdicts for both Michael Steele and Jack Holmes. Multiple appeals have followed over the years, but none have succeeded in overturning the convictions. However, they have kept alternative theories alive in the public imagination. Jack Holmes served more than 2 decades before being released on parole in 2021, and Michael Steele was released recently, in May. The guilty verdicts didn't silence the doubters though. Nearly 3 decades later, supporters of Steele and Holmes still insist the wrong men went down for the Rettendon murders. They say that no forensic evidence directly linked either man to the crime scene. The entire case rested on Darren Nichols, a career criminal who traded his testimony for witness protection and a new identity. Some even claim higher-level London criminals eliminated the Essex Boys for bringing too much heat after Leah Betts' death. Others suggest Irish paramilitaries who were angered by Pat Tate's reckless threats and loose talk about weapons. What do you think? Were the right men arrested and convicted, or is the killer still out there? Share your theory with us in the comments below. And if you want to hear more crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Goodbye for now.